So let me try to do a very brief bio introduction of you. You grew up in the Washington area.
I did.
One of the few, like me. And went to St. Albans, then went to Princeton, I believe, and got your JD or Juris Doctor at Stanford.
I
Is
did.
that right, in 1970? I did. And you were in...
But I want to go even farther
Oh, yeah.
back and say that I had 8 years in D.C. public schools before I had the privilege of going to a private high school.
Well, I went to private school, congressional. We played St. Albans in football.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Yeah. Get knocked around. I was the center. Anyway.
No wonder.
That's right. So after getting your law degree, you worked in the first Bush White House, the George H.W. Bush White House, and then as I think assistant chief of staff for policy or something like that.
I was the general counsel in the U.S. Trade Representative's office.
Okay.
For 3 out of the 4 years of the Bush 41 administration, and then I was a deputy in legislative affairs in the last year of the Bush White House.
And
Bush 41.
Then it sounds like you had a good time in London for a few years, working for Goldman Sachs.
I did.
That's a good place for a young man to be.
I did.
And then came back and worked on the George W. Bush presidential campaign as policy advisor or policy director, and then...
I was policy director of the Bush 2000 campaign, which was, at the time anyway, that was a 2-year job. I showed up, I left Goldman Sachs in London in January of 1999 and started in Austin, Texas in February of 99. So almost a full 2 years on the campaign.
Yeah. And then that led to your being a deputy chief of staff in the White House.
Right.
For a couple of years.
2 years.
And then in 2003 you were named the director of OMB and served for 3 years there when I worked for you. And then 2006, 2009 you were chief of staff. So at what point in your early career did you realize you wanted to be the director of OMB? Do you remember your first ambition?
I was very happy being the deputy chief of staff for policy in the first 2 years of the Bush White House. Mm-hmm. And President Bush called me in, and I forget why I happened to be in the Oval Office, but he said, "Are you free for lunch?" And I said, "Sure." I didn't say like, "Well, let me check my calendar." I said, "Sure," and I had lunch with him in the little private dining room off of the Oval Office, and we chatted about a variety of mostly policy-related things, and then he said, "You know, Mitch Daniels, who was at the time the budget director,
mm-hmm.
told me he's planning to leave in a couple of months and run for governor of Indiana." And he said, have you thought about who his replacement might be? And I had, because Mitch had also confided in me. Mm-hmm. So I had some suggestions. We talked it through. And then he said, well, what about you? He said, "Mitch recommended you." Mm. And I instantly said, "No."
And why was that?
Well, what came out of my mouth, because he said, "Why?"
Mm-hmm.
And what came out of my mouth was, because I'm not mean enough. And he said, "Of course you are."
You can learn.
And so we ended the lunch there.
Yeah.
And then he asked me again a few days later, and I gave the appropriate, what should have been the original appropriate response, which was, "Mr. President, I'm not worthy. I'm sure there are better choices, but if that's where you want me to serve, I'd be honored to serve at OMB."
Yeah.
And so that's the answer I gave. And in, I think, March of '03, maybe June of '03, anyway, I became the budget director.
And I guess there's no single career path that prepares you to be OMB director. A lot of people have been on the Hill in Congress and been budget committee chairs or had some exposure to the budget process.
Right.
You didn't have that background. You had a strong policy background and had worked in the White House, which is obviously a big plus, so you govern. Do you recall your first encounter with the federal budget process? Where you were?
I was a staffer on the Senate Finance Committee
Okay.
in the mid-'80s.
Uh,
And before I worked in Bush 41's administration. So for basically the second Reagan term, I served on the staff of the
you
Senate
worked on
Finance
tax
Committee.
reform.
Only a quarter of it, I was the trade person.
Mhm.
But I had a chance to see some of the workings of the whole budget process, the reconciliation process,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. So I had some familiarity with it, and I also recognized you don't have to work on the Hill very long to recognize that activity is dominated by the march of the budget process,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or at least it used to be.
Yes.
And so I had not a deep familiarity with the budget process, but an appreciation for it,
Mm-hmm.
some understanding of the congressional context, and an understanding of how important it was.
Mm-hmm.
But that's one of the reasons I said no to the president when he first asked me, was that while I had worked on the whole gamut of policy issues for the president for 4 years, because you got to count the 2 years as policy director of the campaign, and then the 2 years as the head of, basically the head of policy in the White House. So I had that background, but I didn't feel like I had the deep budget background that being a budget director might require. And I think I was right and wrong. I think it's better for a budget director to come into the job more prepared with the details of the budget process.
Well, what surprised you when you got there? Things you hadn't anticipated that you had to do or had to learn?
I had a huge amount to learn. I don't think it surprised me. Like I said, that's why I said no to the president in the first place. I had a huge amount to learn, but on the other hand, all of that is in a way teachable to a new budget director, as you and the other experienced professionals at OMB did for me. So that's all teachable. And I think on balance, if I had a choice between a budget director who was steeped in budget process and one who was steeped in the policy priorities of the president, I'd rather take the latter and teach him or her the former than the reverse. So having felt that I was a bad choice by background for budget director at the outset, I felt that my background was actually pretty well suited to the job once I got into it. But it was the hardest job I've ever undertaken.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Did Mitch give you any advice starting out? Do you remember?
I'm sure he did, but I have no recollection of what it is.
What was
I had great admiration for Mitch. I thought
Yeah.
he was a terrific budget director, and just a good public servant, because
Sense of humor.
yeah, because he's honest, he's capable, he's funny,
Mm-hmm.
he's really dedicated to doing the right thing, and so I had a good role model to work off of.
Well, what circumstances did you inherit in terms of the fiscal situation, budget problems as you walked in the door? Was it?
It was bad, and I remember one of my when the Bush administration came in, there were projected surpluses for a number of years.
Right, there have been 4 years of surpluses.
And but they were based on unrealistic projections about economic growth and about revenues, which had been juiced at the end of the Clinton years by the tech bubble, the stock market, and so on. And the bubble burst right at the end of the Clinton administration, and as President Bush predicted on the campaign trail, much to the derision of his political opponents, the U.S. was actually entering a recession as Bush came into office. And I mean, it wasn't declared until much later,
Right.
but what the numbers eventually showed was Bush inherited a recession from Clinton, which basically wiped out the surpluses that were on the horizon.
Right.
Then you add to that a commitment to increase defense spending, which Bush came into office with. Then multiply that by the events of 9/11, 2001, which triggered a dramatic ramp up in both defense and homeland security spending. And then combine that with some Bush tax cuts.
2001, 2003.
Both years. I think both well-timed tax cuts from a fiscal policy standpoint, but also creating a challenge on the budget side. So what had started as surpluses in 2001, the projections of those surpluses quickly disappeared, and then the hole got dug a little bit deeper. So that as I walked in the door, I had the responsibility of, I think within a couple of weeks of my arrival, of doing the mid-year projections and announcing the expectation of the largest budget deficit of any entity in human history, which is a hell of a way to start my job. We were projecting, it was a deficit of somewhere over $400 billion for that upcoming fiscal year. And at the time, that was really big. Now, today, that would be celebrated as a great exercise in fiscal responsibility. And I think that's the deficit we ended up with in that year was, I think, about $410 billion, something like that, which is lower than the lowest deficit of the entire Obama administration. And I bet it's lower than any deficit that the Trump administration could bring us down to. So it's all a question of perspective, but at the time, it wasn't a deep crisis, but it was a matter of very serious concern that we had deficits growing that large.
Yeah. Someone said during that period, somewhere along the way, deficits don't matter, politically at least. So did that make your job more difficult?
Not really. I think it was the vice president who was cited as having said that, and I think he was and is a fiscal conservative, and I think his remark was in the context of what do voters think or something like that. But that wasn't the tenor or the substance of any of the conversations that we had with the president.
Yeah.
We were having these budget conversations in the context of the aftermath of 9/11 and in early 2003, before I became budget director, the initiation of the conflict in Iraq. So there was a dramatic uptick in defense spending, no longer just for sort of hardening the United States purposes, but as well for conducting a real shooting war. And that became the priority. So the conversations with the president were, how do we ensure that we get the money we need to conduct the war on terror, while at the same time not putting us in a disastrous fiscal situation. And by the way, we did manage that. I mean, that $412 billion deficit turned out to be the highest deficit that we had. The subsequent three deficits were all declining numbers, even though we remained in the shooting war. And so the deficits declined, I think, well below 200 billion by 2007. And then the financial crisis of 2008, of course, blew the top off the budget deficit again.
Right. So your hands were full with policy and budget. OMB does a lot on the management front as well. But Clay Johnson was there, and
Mm-hmm.
Robert Shea. Did they mostly
Yep.
handle that for you?
They did. I was interested in that portfolio, but like many budget directors, grabbed by the imperatives of the important,
Uh-huh.
the urgent driving out the important.
Right.
And so I thought we had undertaken some very good and important work in the management portfolio, particularly in trying to introduce more metrics into the evaluation
Right.
of programs and our spending.
Mhm.
But the truth is, like,
Part process,
the
including
part
including
process,
right?
exactly.
Hmm.
But like many budget directors, I got dragged away into
Sure.
the urgent issues of
Yeah.
getting the supplemental that we needed to make sure that the troops had
Yeah.
the food and ammo that they needed.
I want to ask you about a couple of events that occurred on your watch, but first let me ask you your impressions of OMB as an institution. How would you characterize it as an institution? It's there to help the president, not only with budget, but managing the executive branch and a variety of other tasks that come and go, and where he needs help. How does OMB work? How would you characterize that as a part of the government?
I think it's a great institution. I had appreciation for the professionals at OMB before I joined there. I had a deep appreciation and affection by the time I left 3 years later. I think it has been for many years, and I hope continues to be, a place where very competent professionals dedicate their lives to effective management of the budget and the government process. And the enduring impression that I came away from OMB with is that these are some of the best professionals in government, and they work their tails off, sort of thanklessly,
Yeah.
but doing a terrific job for presidents of any political stripe.
Uh-huh.
There was, I'm going to guess that the majority of the professionals at OMB, when we came in 2001, had not voted for President Bush, and I know some new administrations come in with suspicions about OMB,
Mhm.
because it is the only office inside the gates of the White House, really, that is staffed by career professionals, 500 of them.
Uh-huh.
And
And during the transition, the presidential transition, they were the only people home for a while, right?
they're it, and they were critical. But the political types who are coming in naturally have suspicion, especially
Yeah.
if there's been a change of party.
Yeah.
So, people naturally assume, oh, they work for Clinton.
Yeah.
They're going to be trying to undermine the Bush agenda. And I never saw any evidence of that. It was always a sincere effort to try to take the policies of the president and make them make sense in the budget context.
And while we're on this topic, let me jump ahead chronologically to the end of the administration, because I believe President Bush asked you to help smooth the transition, make it a smooth transition to the Obama administration. Is that my recollection?
Yes.
And so, did you help people coming in understand, were you in a position to help people coming in understand what OMB was as an institution? And
Yes.
reduce some of that suspicion that might be there?
Yes. But, well, first of all, on the transition, I was chief of staff for the last 3 years of the Bush administration. And in more than a year before the election, or about a year before the election, the president called me in and said, especially because the country was still on a wartime footing with the homeland under threat, he wanted to be sure that the transition to the new administration was as smooth and professional and as risk-free as it possibly could be. It's a great moment of risk for the country because the White House empties out almost completely. You know, you got a few employees in the mess and a few, butlers and so on, but the West Wing in particular is literally empty at noon on January 20th when the new team starts filtering in. And it's a moment of peril for the country that the president was concerned about. So he directed me as chief of staff to mobilize his administration to give as good and smooth a handoff as we possibly could, regardless of who won the election.
And I think Martha Kumar and other experts on that process give great credit to that transition as one of the best, perhaps, historically.
And it was a cooperative one between I think two very professional and public-spirited presidents who both agreed on that. My counterpart, the person that I dealt with in the Obama transition, was John Podesta, who happens to have been the chief of staff who handed over the keys to the Bush administration on the way in. John Podesta was Bill Clinton's last chief of staff, and so he was an ideal person to be running the Obama transition into government.
Yeah.
The other thing about the Obama administration is that their first budget director was Jack Lew. So, if I'm getting
Peter Orszag.
Sorry, Peter Orszag.
Orszag.
Yeah, that's right.
Lew came
Yeah, Lew came after Orszag. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
But the point still stands is that the people that the Obama administration were bringing in a lot of these key positions were pretty darn experienced hands in the areas in which they were operating. So Peter Orszag has a classic resume for somebody
CDO director.
To be budget director, to be CDO director. That's pretty high up there in the way of experience.
Let me go back in time now to where we were before. One of the things that I think occurred during your tenure was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's the last major reorganization of the executive branch until today, at least, when there are now plans being requested from all of the departments, agencies, for reorganization plans, and then OMB is supposed to take those and look across the agencies, presumably, and look at major options for reorganizing the executive branch. And on paper, at least so far, that's the most ambitious effort to think about reorganizing the executive branch since maybe Nixon or something way back. What lessons do you take from the DHS consolidation of different departments and rearrangement of agencies and responsibilities? What lessons do you draw from that experience that might be helpful going forward? What's that like?
I think probably the lesson I would draw is don't do it. Don't try it. It ain't worth it. Now, the creation of the Homeland Department, I think, was necessary, and it was driven by dramatic external events. The moment when I became a convert to the creation of the the Department of Homeland Security, which we had resisted because we didn't want to get ourselves into a big reorganization jumble and the freeze that causes all over government at a time when we had to respond to the imperatives of 9/11 and to the threats that were coming, and anthrax and to all kinds of stuff that we thought terrorists might then be doing, but we fortunately avoided. So we knew enough, and Andy Card, who was then chief of staff, certainly knew enough. The president knew enough to know that any reorganization effort is much harder than anyone ever imagines it can be, and it causes the wheels of government to grind to a halt while everybody waits to figure out who's going to be where and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Homeland was an exception to that, and the moment of conversion on that for me was the head of legislative affairs came to me and said, X committee, I don't remember which, wants us to send the most senior person in the administration on protecting the United States. And said, so who do we send? And I was stumped. We had created an assistant to the president for Homeland Security, comparable to the assistant to the president for national security.
Right.
But that was a White House official. You don't send those to testify. And it was, I mean, we'd been dealing with the difficulties of keeping all of the pieces of Homeland Security in harness, with, you know, part at Treasury, part at Justice, part at Defense and State, all over the place,
Right.
At Transportation. And I became a convert and said, this really does need to happen.
Uh-huh.
And it's because there's a dramatic change of circumstance, which is that the biggest issue today for the United States didn't even exist 2 years ago. I mean, the subject of Homeland Security wasn't even a subject prior to 2001. And so we pulled together at the president's direction, Andy Card asked me to pull together a group, which I did. I pulled in what I thought were about 5 or 6 of the most capable people around the White House from each of the relevant areas, and we sent them off in secret to create the plan.
Rearrange the pieces?
To rearrange the pieces, and it had to be in secret because if it was in the open, every agency would fight to the death for its turf. Although interestingly, not all the cabinet officers did. And so they put the plan together. It was, I thought, a very well, carefully thought through plan. There were probably some mistakes in the margin. But I think unequivocally they did the right thing. As hard as DHS is to manage these days, imagine how much worse it would be if TSA and Coast Guard were still at the Transportation Department and Customs was at Treasury and Immigration was at Justice, Border Patrol is at Justice, Secret Service is at Treasury. I think it would have been unmanageable, and it probably produced a lot of mistakes.
Better off, but it was high friction.
It was a high friction thing, but we had a political moment when we could.
Did OMB staff get involved? At what stage did they get involved?
After the plan was formed, OMB staff, came in to help with the details, how to readjust the budget categories and so on. They were critical to that. And Mitch had a designee who was a participant in the formulation, and I don't remember who it was, but OMB played obviously.
And Andrew Abrams, who was fairly junior at that stage, played a big role. Okay. I want to ask you about Katrina. That certainly vividly in my memory is a big event during your tenure, and that's when
as budget director,
during your tenure as budget director. And I recall after the initial mishaps, people turned to OMB and said, "Can you help fix this?" Is my memory correct? Is that
Yes.
What happened? Yeah.
Well, within a day or two of Katrina, I was summoned to the Hill to try to justify what the supplemental request that we were going to make to cover the costs of this disaster. And the Republican conference was up in arms, and I went up and I think I gave an estimate of, this could cost as much as $10 billion. And, there were like hoots and this is the House Republican conference, which is much more unruly than the Senate. But there were hoots and catcalls, and people may have thrown things at me for suggesting that we might willy-nilly do a supplemental of $10 billion to deal with this crisis. And of course, in the end, we ended up spending well over $100 billion. So I was dramatically underestimating what the cost would be of the recovery there. But
yeah.
I mean, it was an honest estimate at the time. We really had no idea, so we just kind of had to make it up. Because at OMB, most people would like to wait until they have enough information to make a proposal or take a position. You don't have that luxury at OMB. If it's time, if you need the money to a supplemental to deal with a crisis like that, you've got to take your best guess and tell them how much you think it is, and hope you get close to right.
Yeah. But OMB also played a role, I believe, in sort of pulling together some of the threads that needed to be pulled together to manage the recovery and get it back on track, as I recall. That was a big effort for a lot of us.
That was a big effort. It was another lesson which I hope that Homeland Security, which now has FEMA inside it, is now better equipped to manage, because I thought during that period that OMB was called on to do some things, to try to fix some things that were pretty far outside the scope of what the budget office ought to be doing. But we had some of the best, most experienced professionals in government, so they're the people I would turn to
Pulled
in a
into
crisis.
the breach, or thrown into the
Thrown in, yeah.
So the budget process continues to evolve, shall we say, or deconstruct, depending on how you view it. How do you see things moving since your time? How's it different in the last few years, and especially now than it was back then?
It was difficult back then, but it was still possible periodically, actually, to put a budget resolution through both houses. I felt it was still possible to appropriate, go regular order.
Did you finish appropriations by October 1st in any of the years when you were there?
I doubt it. I doubt it. But we did manage to appropriate in most of the years that I was around, most of the Bush years. But just appropriating is now not the norm. I mean, it was a troubled system during the Bush years that I think basically collapsed completely during the Obama years.
Is it simply a victim of the polarization and narrow partisan margins in Congress and in the nation, or is it something about the process itself that's flawed that needs to be corrected?
It's probably both. Yeah. I think the system could work in a less partisan environment, but it's a pretty hard system to make work as it's now structured. And so, I mean, I think folks who have been pressing some kind of budget reform, including Steve, you, are on the right track with very sensible proposals. And some of them, you don't have to change it that much to dramatically improve the prospects of getting a budget resolution.
Do you have a favorite reform idea you'd like to see enacted to lead to better decisions?
There are a few. I like the idea of multi-year budgeting. I like strengthening the hand of the budget committees in producing an enforceable budget resolution. I don't Well, you're much more the expert on that than I am, so
Within
I'll
which you
turn
need
it
to
around. I'll turn it around to you. But
Yeah.
there's no shortage of ideas and reasonable things to be done to stabilize the process. I mean, the real impediment right now is any political will
Yeah.
to cooperate enough to make that happen.
It did look as though reform was getting to be on the agenda last year when Chairman Price and Chairman Enzi both had lists of ideas that they've held hearings on them and seemed aimed at producing legislation. But then, of course, Price went into the new administration, and I think Republicans may have lost interest when they got a Republican president, at least for the time being. But I suppose the window for reform will open unpredictably, perhaps.
Hope so.
Would-
And I'm not pessimistic that it's permanently closed.
Right.
But right now, it looks pretty grim.
So right now, do you have any insight into what's likely to happen in the next few months? Are we going to get a budget resolution for 2018? Are we going to have a regular budget process? The president, I think, is going to introduce more detailed proposals in about 10 days or so. So that ordinarily would start the process. It's a little bit later in a transition year than it would be otherwise. But
Yeah.
not much time to produce a budget resolution and then appropriations before the beginning of the fiscal year, so that doesn't look promising. But and then there's the issue of the debt ceiling. How do you see these things playing out over the next few months? Or can you?
Well, first of all, you asked me at the outset what surprised me when I came in, and you've just reminded me of one of the things that really surprised me, which is how many budget years are happening at once when you're at OMB. You know, you're trying to execute on, or in the current case, even just get some legislation through the Congress on the budget year that you're already in. You're presenting your budget for the fiscal year coming up, and trying to get the Congress to deal with that. And you are doing the planning, and this is the only real planning you can do, is if you're in, let's say, May of 2017, it's very hard to do much planning for the budget. Well, you can't do any planning for the budget that you're already in fiscal 17. You can kind of present a skinny plan for 18, which is what the administration has done. But the real planning you should be doing is to begin the process of the budget that will be presented.
And the departmental budget directors know that. They won't wait for OMB to tell them to start.
Yeah.
They'll start
They'll
now.
start.
They're already started if they're allowed to start thinking about 2019.
Yeah, but I imagine that also came as a big surprise to the Trump administration. And so I think they've been somewhat on the back foot in trying to catch up with those 3 years at once. As to what I think will happen from here for the balance of this year, I think there's a good chance of getting a 2018 budget resolution done this year, if for no other reason than you need to do a budget resolution to have the possibility of a reconciliation vehicle that might carry tax reform, which is such a high priority for the administration and for the members. So I think a reasonable chance of getting a budget resolution done, I would say a pretty big challenge in actually appropriating on regular order before the fiscal year gets underway. That seems to me to be something of a stretch. And the history of the last many years is continuing resolutions and operating under caps.
And you haven't mentioned infrastructure, which some people thought would be part of the mix at this point because it has some bipartisan appeal, if nothing else, and might be something to put on the table, therefore, in a bipartisan negotiation. Have you seen, is that still a prospect?
I think it is. It's more distant now than I would have thought it would be.
Mhm.
I agree with you. It's one of the areas where there's some bipartisan agreement on expanded government investment. But there's pretty broad disagreement on how much ought to be spent and where it ought to come from. So my instinct is maybe it'll get wrapped up in tax reform, but on the more likely assumption that it's not wrapped up in tax reform, that infrastructure isn't made a part of tax reform. I think it's behind tax reform in the queue, so it's probably not a 2017 issue.
So would you trade the problems you had for the problems that Mulvaney has now?
No. No, and I mean our budget situation is worse,
Mm-hmm.
and our politics are worse than at the time I was doing it. I mean, remember when I was the budget director, as horrifying as it was to have to, do the press conference announcing the largest budget deficit of any entity in human history. We were still in below 40% of GDP was our debt ratio.
Yeah.
Our debt was I think in the high 30s at the time, and we were projecting that it could go as high as the low 40s or something like that. And here we are sitting today, and our debt to GDP ratio is almost twice as much, in the upper 70s. And that's a much more difficult situation to be in. And with the political system being as dysfunctional as it is now, very hard to see what your path out of it is. I came into the budget job with some real optimism that we could do a responsible Medicare reform that would help contain long-term costs. I had real optimism that we could do responsible Social Security reform that would contain long-term costs. Those being two of the biggest contributors
Right.
to our real budget problem.
Sure.
And we made a go of it, and I think didn't come as close as I would have liked, but we made a go of it, and it was a serious prospect. And today it's hard to see the path to that.
Yeah. So we're on an unsustainable path, but we don't see a way to get off.
Yeah, I mean you can see the ways to get off today as we saw them 10 or 12 years ago. But 10 or 12 years on, they're harder to do because we're in a much deeper hole.
Yeah.
Number one, and number two, the politics of bipartisan cooperation, which would be necessary to do something like this, they're just not there. I think they were plausible 10 or 12 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Looks tough. So any final reflections on your experience? Are you looking back on it now?
I tell you, somebody came up to me when I was just first announced as chief of staff in early 2006. Somebody came up to me and said, boy, thank you for taking on this new assignment. You must be completely worn out after 3 years as the budget director, 2 years as deputy chief, 2 years as on the campaign. How can you take on this horrible, hard job? And the only thing that flashed through my mind was, oh, thank God I don't have to be the budget director. And I felt that way, not because I didn't like being the budget director. I loved being the budget director. If you're interested in government policy, there is no better job in the world, I think, than being the director of OMB. But it's a really hard job because you have to deal with everything. It's an enormously full inbox, and you can't control it. And so the reason I was relieved to become chief of staff to the president, which is a pretty hard job on its own, was that you get to control more of the agenda. You get to focus on what the president's priorities are. But when you're the budget director, you need to be on top of and decide something about every portion of the budget and try your best not to make mistakes. And so I remember I would often go home from the old EOB, from my OMB office late at night, would head home with my head hurting because, and so it was a physical manifestation that I'd never had before of trying to put stuff into my head that was already too full. And so, ironically, I always felt about OMB that I never was able to do the job justice because there is so much to do and so much to understand.
Yeah.
Which I actually didn't have that feeling about any other job I've had in my career, including some pretty senior jobs.
Hopefully you've been able to forget a bunch of stuff since then.
I've forgotten more than I remember about budget stuff. And the other thing is I came away with a lot of gratitude to the professionals at OMB, who really are among the best in government service anywhere in the world.
I always felt that way. That's why I loved working there.
Yeah.
People.
Well, that's why they kept people like you. Why OMB still does keep good people in harness, doing a pretty thankless job. I mean, it's not like the agencies love their budget examiner. These are tough jobs, but it is a great professional core, and I'll always consider it among the most worthwhile professional experiences of my life.
Thank you, Josh. It's been great.
Thank you.
It's terrific. Okay, we ended on time.
Thank you for being
Not bad.